Welp. Greetings and hello. Today we will be going through the origins of the Cold War from 1941 to 1953. We will start off with the Grand Alliance. The Grand Alliance was made up of the big three allies from World War II: Britain, the USA, and the USSR. They were united by their desire to defeat Nazi Germany, but as the war ended, tensions emerged. The Big Three discussed Europe's future at Tehran and Yalta. In November 1943, the Grand Alliance held a conference in Tehran. The talks focused on plans to defeat the Nazis. But the Allies also started to discuss what would happen to Europe and Germany after the war. Britain and the USA were politically very different from the USSR, and there were tensions between the three allies. These were put aside through the duration of the conflict, as they fought a common enemy, Germany. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and US President Franklin D. Roosevelt agreed the USSR could claim a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe after the war was over. Eastern European countries would be subject to Soviet policies and ideas. Now, the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was also known as the Soviet Union. The Grand Alliance made more decisions about the future of Europe at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Free elections would be held in previously occupied countries in Eastern Europe. The Big Three, plus France, would divide Germany and Berlin between them, and the United Nations, or UN, would replace the failed League of Nations. Now, a comment and analysis for this section. The Allies had different interpretations of a free election. To the USA and Britain, it meant lots of free political parties competing for votes. But Stalin, the leader of the USSR, believed only communist parties should run in the elections, as they were the only parties that, quote-unquote, truly represented the people. Now, the Potsdam Conference revealed the first cracks in the Grand Alliance. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Allied leaders met again at Potsdam over July and August. They wanted to work on the finer details for their plans of Germany and Europe. Some important agreements were made at Potsdam. The exact division of Germany and Berlin was determined. The new boundaries of Poland would be agreed, and the Nazi leaders would be tried for war crimes at Nuremberg. The Yalta Conference had gone quite smoothly, but sorting out these finer details at Potsdam caused a lot of disagreement between the Allied leaders. Some things remained undecided. For example, Germany would be divided into 4 zones, one each for Britain, France, the USA, and the USSR. But the Allies didn't decide if or even when the zones could rejoin and form a country again. The tensions were high. Roosevelt had died and Harry Truman had succeeded him as US President. Truman was more suspicious of the USSR and less willing to compromise. Now, during this period, Britain had also elected a new leader, Clement Attlee, who replaced Winston Churchill mid-conference. Britain and the US were also alarmed by Stalin's actions in Poland. He was installing a government consisting of only pro-communist members. Britain and the US felt this went against the Yalta Agreement. Now, the USA and the USSR had very different ideological beliefs. The tension between the USA and the USSR was partly different was partly caused by their very different beliefs. The USA was capitalist. It had a democratically elected government. Its economy was based on private ownership of property, free competition, and forces of supply and demand. And its population was mainly Christian. The USSR was communist. It was a single-party state. Its economy was controlled by the state with no private ownership of property. The Communist Party promoted atheism and also discouraged religious beliefs and practices. Communism was aimed at world revolution, and so it was feared by the Americans as a danger to their democracy. However, the communists were also scared by worldwide American influence. Now the USA emerged from the Second World War as the two biggest powers in the world, but they were very suspicious of one another and began to interpret each other's actions as threats. The United States of America kept their atom bomb secret. Japan was on Germany's side in the war and continued to fight after Germany surrendered in May 1945. In August 1945, the USA dropped 2 atom bombs on Japan, destroying the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atom bombs meant that military help from the USSR wasn't needed to defeat Japan. President Truman also refused to allow the USSR to take part in the US occupation of Japan. Now the atom bomb caused huge devastation in Hiroshima. The USA kept the exact nature of the atom bomb a secret from the USSR at Potsdam in July 1945, although Stalin's spies had passed on many details. These nuclear weapons boosted the status of the USA. For 4 years, it was the world's only nuclear power. Stalin saw the development of the atom bomb as an attempt to intimidate the USSR, and was angry that the USA had managed to surpass Soviet technology. The atom bombs increased the rivalry between the USA and the USSR. The USSR sped up the development of its own atomic bomb, starting an arms race between the two countries. The USSR became influential in Eastern Europe. At the end of the Second World War, the Red Army, the USSR's army, occupied Eastern Europe. These countries would pass into the USSR's sphere of influence after the war. Between 1945 and 1948, Stalin installed pro-Soviet puppet governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. For a while, it seemed that Czechoslovakia might remain democratic, but when the Communist Party seemed likely to lose ground in the next election, it seized power in February 1948. The exception to Soviet domination was Yugoslavia, which had freed itself from the Germans without the Red Army. Yugoslavia was communist, but more open to the West. Its leader, Josip Broz Tito, argued with Stalin over political interference. Stalin cut off aid, but didn't invade. Now Yugoslavia's borders also notably cut off Albania, meaning that in later years of the Cold War, Albania would lose its influence from the USSR and later refer to China for help. Countries under the influence of the USSR became known as its satellite states. Increasing tensions between the USA and the USSR became known as the Cold War. There was no direct fighting. Both sides were afraid of another war, especially after 1949, when the USSR had its own nuclear weapons. Countries in Western Europe tended to support the USA, Most countries in Eastern Europe were dominated by the USSR. In a famous speech in 1946, Winston Churchill warned there was an Iron Curtain dividing Europe. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech demonstrates the breakdown of the Grand Alliance. Britain and the USA now viewed the USSR as a threat, not an ally. The Cold War was a period of international tension, with each side suspicious of the other. The Long and Novikov telegrams were detailed reports. By 1946, tensions between the superpowers were high. Each country issued secret telegrams about the other. The telegrams were detailed reports describing the motivations and intentions of the other country. The Long telegram, in 1946 February, issued to President Truman about the USSR. It stated that Stalin had given a speech in favor of the destruction of capitalism. It warned of the USSR trying to weaken and divide Western powers, while building the strength of its own military. And there was the Novikov telegram in September 1946. This was issued to Stalin about the USA. The report claimed that the USA was pursuing world supremacy. It warned that America was trying to limit the influence of the USSR in Europe. Neither country seemed to know for certain what the other was thinking. The reports panicked the Russian and American governments and accelerated the Cold War. The findings seemed to confirm their worst fears. Truman acted to contain the communist threat. President Truman was extremely worried about the spread of communism to Western Europe. Many countries were undergoing economic hardships, which he thought might make communism look good and more appealing. The USA decided to intervene in Europe to try and contain the spread of communism. The Truman Doctrine was announced in March 1947. This meant that the USA pledged to support any nation threatened by a communist takeover. The support could be diplomatic, military, to do with the military, or financial. For example, the USA gave $400 million of aid to Turkey and Greece to stop communism spreading there. The Marshall Plan was also announced in 1947 in June. This promised $17 billion of aid to European countries to help rebuild their economies. The areas of Germany under Western occupation benefited massively. Stalin, however, ordered all of his satellite states to reject the plan. He believed that the USA was using economic incentives to lure the Eastern European states away from the USSR. The USSR reacted by creating Comintern. Stalin felt threatened by the Truman Doctrine and reacted by strengthening and uniting his allies. Comintern, the Communist Information Bureau, was set up in September 1947. The organization brought together all European Communist parties and placed them under the control of the USSR. Comecon, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, was established in January 1949. It countered the Marshall Plan by nationalizing industries, collectivizing agriculture, and offering economic aid. Stalin hoped this would encourage economic development in Eastern Europe and discourage trade with the West. It also appeased the countries that had been ordered to refuse the Marshall Aid. The Marshall Plan Aid ensured that a lot of Western Europe would become allied with the USA. Stalin's retaliation, his creation of Cominform, and later Comecon strengthened his alliances in Eastern Europe. Tension over the division of Germany had been building since the Potsdam Conference and finally spilled over in the Berlin Crisis in 1948. It resulted in an even larger rift between the two great powers. In 1948, the USSR and the West clashed over Berlin. Immediately after the war, there were 4 zones of occupied Germany and 4 zones in Berlin. In 1947, the USA and Britain agreed to combine their zones to form Bezonia. In the next year, the French agreed to add their zone. The new Western Zone had a single government and in June 1948 introduced a new currency to help economic recovery. This allowed the USSR. Stalin did not want a unified Western Zone on his doorstep. West Berlin's strong capitalist economy embarrassed the USSR and made communism look weak. Berlin was in East Germany. The French, British, and US sectors formed West Berlin, while the Soviet sector was called East Berlin. Now this allowed Stalin to blockade Berlin to try and force the West to withdraw from West Berlin. In June 1948, he ordered that all road, rail, and canal links between West Berlin and the outside world should be cut off. Stalin wanted to force the West to withdraw from Berlin altogether. The Western powers, though, believed that if this happened, the Soviet Union would be tempted to invade West Germany. The Western powers wouldn't give up West Berlin. The West decided to bypass the blockade and fly in supplies. This became known as the Berlin Airlift and lasted for 318 days. By 1949, 8,000 tons of supplies were being flown in each day. The Tegel Airport was built in West Berlin to accommodate the large volume of flights. Immense supplies could be delivered in even greater numbers. After the war, Germany was divided into 2. When it became clear that the West was determined not to withdraw from Berlin, Stalin had to lift the blockade. It was also clear that Germany would remain divided. The end of the Berlin blockade increased tensions as Stalin hadn't lifted the blockade willingly. The Allies appeared strong and had discredited and humiliated Joseph Stalin. In 1949, 2 separate states were formed, West Germany, or the Federal Republic of Germany, and Communist East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic. The 2 powers formed military alliances after this. Stalin's blockade during the Berlin Crisis showed how unprepared the West would be if there was conflict with the USSR. As a consequence, the Western powers decided to form a military alliance. In 1949, NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was created. All members of NATO agreed to respond together if any member of the alliance was attacked. Now the USSR saw the formation of NATO as a real threat. And on a side note here, they actually did try to apply to join it. However, when the Western powers refused, inevitably, the USSR used this as an excuse to establish the Warsaw Pact in 1945 to rival NATO. All of the USSR satellite states, except Yugoslavia, became members. Its main aims were to improve the defensive capability of Eastern Europe and strengthen relations. There were now two blocs in Europe, the NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Now the members of the Warsaw Pact formed the so-called Eastern Bloc, which is where we get our divide of Western and Eastern Europe to this day. Later now in the Cold War, the USA and the USSR tried to gain an advantage by forming military alliances and developing ever more powerful weapons. The aim was to look strong and deter the other from attacking. The USA and the USSR thus began an arms race. During the Cold War, the USA and the USSR worked to develop the most powerful weapons they could. Neither side could really wanted to use these weapons, but both felt the other couldn't be allowed to gain an advantage. The fear was that if either gained a significant military advantage, that country might be tempted to trigger a war to take advantage of the situation. Instead, a standoff developed where both countries didn't dare act against the other, but didn't dare to get left behind either. This competition sometimes spilled over into other areas. For example, when the USSR launched the first satellite into space, the USA quickly developed one of its own. This so-called space race led to the USSR sending the first man into space in 1961, and to the USA sending astronauts to the moon in 1969. Both countries developed nuclear stockpiles. The USA, as we said before, developed its own atom bomb during the Second World War and used it against Japan. Now we also stated that the USSR wasn't far behind, and in 1949 they succeeded in exploding its own atom bomb. Now the USA detonated the first hydrogen bomb, an even more powerful type of nuclear bomb, in 1952. The USSR had followed with its own hydrogen bomb by 1955. In August 1957, the Soviets successfully tested the first intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM for short, which could strike the USA after being launched within the USSR and was virtually unstoppable. The USA first successfully tested an ICBM in 1959. Then it quickly increased its stock of these missiles until it had a significant advantage over the USSR. Then the USSR began catching up again as American resources were diverted into a war in Vietnam. This time is in the 1960s. The arms race was also fueled by the fear and suspicion created by other events. The formation of NATO in 1949, as we discussed earlier, made the USSR feel militarily vulnerable. In February 1950, Communist China and the USSR signed a treaty of alliance which strengthened Western fears that the USSR was planning communist domination. Now by this point, the USSR and the USA has the power to destroy each other multiple times over. As tensions increased, it felt like that the threat of a nuclear war became a real possibility. Khrushchev raised hopes of peaceful coexistence. In 1953, Stalin died, and another member of the Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev, took power. Khrushchev said that he wanted peaceful coexistence with the West. His words brought hope that there would be a quote-unquote thaw in the Cold War. But Khrushchev remained very competitive with the USA. He wanted communism to spread, but he thought that the best way to achieve this was to clearly demonstrate its superiority, not to defeat the West in the war. Now, because Khrushchev continued to develop weapons, the West still felt threatened, and the arms race did not slow down. As we hit the end of this video, I would like to thank you all for watching, as next time we will discuss the divisions in Eastern Europe.
Alright.